Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Rockefeller Foundation's live stream, AI Governance, Shaping a Framework that Benefits All. My name is Zia Khan, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Innovation at the Rockefeller Foundation. Today, we're discussing artificial intelligence, a vastly complex topic that has the potential to transform how we live and how we interact with each other. AI has many virtues, as well as many risks, all of which are on vivid display during this time of global turmoil. In fact, the current pandemic is accelerating AI's integration into nearly every aspect of our lives. How we manage AI's role in addressing the crisis, and in the future, managing our recovery, will undoubtedly define the next era. As we reimagine a way forward, the Rockefeller Foundation is betting that AI will help rebalance and reset the future in a way that addresses current inequities. To realize that outcome, we need to reimagine an entire new rulemaking system that guides AI towards society's goals instead of our current de facto rulemaking system that guides AI towards the market's goals. Last fall, we convened a unique group of technologists, philosophers, economists, lawyers, artists, and philanthropists at our Bellagio Center in Italy to explore how AI can be harnessed to create a better future for humanity. As a result of this meeting, we recently launched a report, AI Plus One. I have it right over here. Shaping an Integrated Future, a collection of thoughts, ideas, and calls to action on artificial intelligence, written by some of the most promising minds in the world who are exploring this field. One of the ideas that came out of that meeting is that we need to be more proactive in guiding the course of AI development. With no roadmap, we risk creating more problems instead of solving meaningful ones. And that brings us to today's conversation around AI governance, a topic that will become increasingly vital during the pandemic and beyond. Now, let me just say one word about governance. It doesn't just mean government laws and regulations. What we are talking about is a little more expansive in terms of the combination of rules and rituals in society that influence behaviors. So as an example I like to use, it's like littering, where in the 1960s and 50s, there were lots of regulations and laws put in place against littering, but also some social norms and behaviors where I challenge you to try it. If you're driving down the road, it's now actually quite hard to throw something out of your car when you're driving. So it's that kind of broader context of governance that we're exploring here. So with that, I'd love to introduce you to our panelists. So first, Sonal Shah, who is the founding executive director of the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation. Second, Mary Gray, who's a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research and faculty associate at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center. And third, Sasha Costanza-Schock, who's an associate professor of civic media at MIT and co-lead for the Algorithmic Justice League's Algorithmic Vulnerability Bounty Project. So let me just thank everyone for joining us today, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. To kick us off, let me first ask a question to you, Sonal. Many of us are familiar with the possibilities of how AI can be deployed for private gain. Can you share some best practice examples of how the public sector has experienced adopting new technologies and AI? What are you most optimistic about?
First of all, Zia, thank you for hosting this conversation, such an important conversation, and really appreciated your defining AI and what we were talking about at the beginning and governance at the beginning, because too often it's just government regulation, but not thinking about the norms and practices, and really appreciated that. And what an honor to be sharing this with Mary and Sasha. It's so great to have this conversation, and hopefully we'll be having many more of these conversations going forward. So just quickly, to answer your question regarding public sector and how AI is used by the public sector, there's multiple ways that it's being used, and there's more ways it can be used. So let me give one example of how it is being used in disaster assistance. Where should we be placing all of our materials and things that might be needed after a disaster, whether it's in Florida, should it be in Louisiana, where can we bring in the materials on a constant basis, really thinking about where the transportation routes are. Knowing that is super important, and being prepared is super important. We know what happens when we're not prepared, and we know what happens when we are. And it allows us to have some predictions on what is needed or what we think can happen. And AI is super useful for that. Another place, and just give one more example, is thinking about in personnel hiring. Where are the gaps? What do we need? What's missing? How do we think about it? And using AI effectively allows us to know where and how we should be searching, looking, how we find the right skill sets, what skill sets are missing. Too we only look at resumes and not skill sets, but that AI can help us with. And that is just using an algorithm and the data that's available to make sure, and thinking about the data we're bringing in to make sure we're thinking about what we're using it for, and the design matters. So I think one of the things I'm sure we'll talk about a lot is not just AI itself, but the design by which we are doing it, who's being included, what kind of data are we collecting, from whom are we collecting that data, and what are we using it for? And from the public sector side, are we thinking through how it will be used and who will get access to it? So it's important, all of those questions. It's not just AI is a good thing, but it's also all of those design questions that come with it. And at least from my experience in public sector, it's something that we have spent a lot of time making sure that we think about all of those design questions.
No, that's fantastic, Sonal. And just the promise of AI to gather more information, help us make more decisions is so interesting to lots of people. And then I guess what we worry about is how do we not reproduce the problems we have with our current systems as well. So Sasha, let me ask you the next question. Tim O'Reilly recently wrote in his piece for the Rockefeller Foundation's AI+1 report that systems and architectures that distribute rather than central the power of AI may well be the key to its governance. I think that resonates with some of your theories of meaningful community participation in design decisions, which Sonal was just referring to. Can you elaborate a little on those theories and perhaps share some examples of the flaws that you're trying to, or some of the success cases?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me as part of the conversation. Examples of flaws, well, we can give examples of flaws all day. So at the top of the mind right now would be in the UK, an algorithm was used to decide students' university entrance A-level grades after classes were cut short due to the pandemic. And so that reproduced bias based on where they live. And just yesterday and continuing on today, hundreds of students were protesting. And yesterday they were marching and chanting, F the algorithm. Another great example, I don't know if great is the right word here, but just recently Detroit police arrested a man named Robert Williams on his front lawn in front of his wife and 2 young daughters because the facial recognition technology that the police were using can't tell Black people apart. So distributing power is absolutely important. I agree with that, but we also are going to need effective governance mechanisms at multiple levels. For example, in the face space, there are city-by-city bans and moratoria on law enforcement use of face surveillance technology. We passed one, here in Cambridge and in Boston. There are state-level bills, and there's a new federal bill, which is the Facial Recognition and Biometric Technology Moratorium Act of 2020. And in the longer term, we're going to need more than just bills. I like that emphasis that it's also about sort of norms, but also on the technical side, we're going to need a stronger ecosystem of people who can do verification, who can do intersectional bias auditing, who can do human in the loop analysis of the harms that are produced by these systems at the place that they actually interface with people. And we're also going to need mechanisms for redress for people who've been harmed by algorithmic decision-making systems. So for me personally, one of the hats that I wear is as a senior research fellow with the Algorithmic Justice League. We have recently put out a statement that we said we need to fight face surveillance to defend Black lives in the midst of the, mass mobilizations for Black lives. And we've also recently released a white paper that explores an FDA-like agency for the oversight of facial recognition technologies. But in terms of the principles that you asked me about that can guide the development of both the technologies themselves as well as the governance mechanisms that will shape them, I think that we need to be guided by the principle from the disability justice movement of nothing about us without us. So people who might be harmed by these systems need to be at the table, both throughout the development life cycle and also in developing the policies and mechanisms that are going to shape their deployment and use.
Thanks, Sasha. I really like that phrase of nothing about us without us. It sort of implies a nice sort of user-centered design approach to these rules and regulations and rituals that will eventually, hopefully, put in place to capture all the benefits. My next question will be to Mary. So, Mary, as you've been thinking about the interplay between social and human impact of technology and AI, could you expand more on your current research and maybe share with us how common or how rare it is for the social and human impact to be a consideration in the design of algorithm systems, picking up on what Sasha was just describing?
Yeah, I mean, and I want to echo the thanks for convening this discussion. It's a critical moment as we're looking at so many systems breaking down and so many efforts to fold AI into the process as a helper. So it's important to note after the 5 years of research that my collaborator Sidar Suri and I did looking at the world of on-demand labor, contract labor that's ostensibly put together to train artificial intelligence to basically come up with the training data that helps computer scientists and engineers model human decision making. That what we see is often it's not necessarily intentional, but there is a layer of algorithmic cruelty, we call it in our book, that falls out of many systems that are built without a clear sense of the multiple stakeholders. And I really want to lift up what Sasha just said about the kind of intersectional analysis that you need to be able to see not just is a company potentially releasing something that doesn't have the proper security or privacy in place, but who are the myriad stakeholders who are going to be affected by what you build. That is in a lot of cases absent. When it's present, it's often because the designers, the engineers, particularly startup companies, have somebody present who cares, and they might be personally impacted by these systems or have had the experience of having a system fail because they're not part of the design. So in so many cases, we found the good actors who are trying really, really hard are working in an environment that does not require any sort of systematic analysis of you could say an environmental impact is perhaps the framework we could work with for this conversation, the impact of what it is that somebody's building. I want to take a step back and just for people listening to get us all thinking about what is artificial intelligence. It's software deployed in the world. I mean, we really want to make sure we're catching the substance here that we're trying to grapple with. It's ostensibly always human-made. It doesn't fall from the sky. It's not making itself, despite the headlines. So thinking about this as a technical suite of systems that are meant to replicate and in some cases impersonate human decision making is so critical to this discussion of rules and rituals. I love that framework because right now we don't have either rules or rituals in place for thinking. We are producing technologies that have social impact in all cases precisely because they're distributed across so many different social domains. And that's a very different endeavor than building software that's going to be, shrink wrapped, put on a disk and sit on a shelf. So we are at the very beginning of understanding that when we're looking at what it is we need to establish as the baseline rules and rituals, it needs to be around what we're making. If we wait until after something's built, regulation is necessary. It will never be sufficient. We will always be chasing something that did not have society in mind. We have to start building in those rules and rituals to the process of what's being made.
Fantastic. And I just want to offer a quick reminder to our audience that if you're watching this live, please feel free to submit your questions on whatever social platform you're on. Something that I've heard in all your statements do circle around this question of, rules and rituals. And let's just use that as the framework for this conversation, because it has a convenient alliteration and it doesn't sort of have too many inferences around regulations and laws that I think people overly associate with governance. And, one of the challenges that I see is that, this is a very complicated system with lots of different actors. And even if each actor is trying to do the right thing in their own context, it might have unintended consequences for another actor. And this is assuming that everyone's trying to do the right thing, which, we don't have to assume. But to take as a starting point, usually it's government that tries to play this, system role and to create some of this overlay. So I'm curious if I could turn to you, Sonal, for a moment, as someone who has, certainly been in government and has some perspectives around government. When you think about, the constraints of the current bureaucratic systems that we have around digital technology tools, and we all have those vivid memories or vivid visuals of the testimonies in Congress in mind, from the public sector leaders' perspective, what do they need in order to be most helpful on this problem? What do they need to hear? What mindsets do they need to shift? What are the limitations of what they can do? I'd love to hear your perspective on this as we think about rules and rituals.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Zia, and I think it's an important question of the role of the public sector in when it is setting up the rules and rituals, or practices is another term we can use. And it's interesting with the public sector. I think we remember the public sector when something goes wrong, but we don't actually think about the public sector when things are going right. So we know, for example, when Sasha's example of when the police are using facial recognition technology wrong, but we wouldn't think about it when we did, if we do disaster assistance properly or other pieces. So I think it's important that we think about that. But I think there's three roles I think the public sector plays. One is the practices it uses within the public sector in buying, developing, using AI, and that is, as Mary explained, the software, making sure that the problems we are solving aren't creating new problems, but testing it. Who else might be affected? How might they be affected? How, and really playing it out. It's not just you buy the software and you implement the software. It's that you buy the software, you test what happens with it, who's being affected, and then re-ask that question, and making sure community groups and those that might be affected are at the table and understanding that. So are we never going to make mistakes? No, that's never going to be a change. We are going to make mistakes. The whole point of software is we learn and we adapt and we change. It's not just something we create once and it's done. It's an adaptive policy. It's an adaptive practice that we use. The second role of government is thinking about the governance systems it sets up both nationally and globally. So this is not, data and information isn't a national border conversation. It's not like it's in the state border of DC, or if it's in the state border of Texas. It's actually something that's traveling, and everybody has access to it, and we all use the different tools that we use, and we give our data, and we give it in many different ways. The question is, who has access to it? How do they have access? What are the practices they use when they have access to it? How is it being used? That's an important question, and that's a role that government can play, is convene those conversations, ask those. And it's got to be both with the public sector, the private sector, and the social sector, having these conversations and setting up these governance norms and rules. And the final is the global conversation, because again, it's not national. These are also global boundaries that we're talking about, and how do we do that? So those are important questions for us to be asking, and that is an important role of the public sector. It's a user, but it's also the governing mechanism by which society has a conversation. A company doesn't have to talk to 300 million people in the United States. The government of the United States has to talk to 300 million people in the United States. Mm-hmm. A company worries about its group of people. A nonprofit is worrying about its constituency that it's helping. But what a government has to do is take into account everybody, and making sure that we understand the harms that might be caused to one group that another group, because we're trying to solve one problem, we may create another problem. And that's just important for us to keep in mind. But again, I would just keep, the one word I would keep in mind is we have to be adaptive, and we have to test. If we don't test and we're not adapting, then we're not using technology or the algorithms effectively.
So, Sonal, you mentioned something very interesting here, which is around this notion of borders, right? And how governments have the borders to some degree define the constituents that they have to be responsible to. Mary, I'm curious, because in the preparation for this, you shared some interesting perspectives around, we now have enormous companies that transcend borders, and they interact with their users in addition to other constituencies as well. So I'm curious what you've observed in terms of what these very large companies now are doing, because in a sense they have a scope and scale that's really, really, really large, and even bigger than some of the big companies that we've seen in previous eras where regulation was introduced and innovation. So what are you observing in terms of what companies are doing, and what help could they get from the government, or what's the way that government and companies could support each other in getting to the right outcomes?
Right. I think if we keep in mind this, fundamental shift to paying attention to how AI is made and really see it as a process, a labor process, then we have a mechanism for managing, regulating, auditing the labor, the work that goes into building artificial intelligence. And that includes the materials that are going in, so the data that is either scraped from users, and again, taking a step back, artificial intelligence runs on our social interactions, our conversations with medical professionals, our taking our car to a mechanic. Like, it's not just tech companies, it's every domain that's gathering data about our exchanges in the world, but particularly our social exchanges that we put online, or that other and other institutions might put online and make readily available to engineers who need stores and stores of data to be able to train, to be able to model how are people making decisions around medicines they choose, for example, or when they get their car tuned. That recognizing that's one source of data, that means we should always know, when is the data we're generating being repurposed, not for helping my mechanic tune my car, but to train algorithms to have a better understanding of how cars work. That's a very, hop up a level. And that is the domain of the work that goes into building artificial intelligence that we could track as a mechanism for thinking about what we've called, and that I'm working directly with the Partnership on AI to think about, what would an accountability for a global AI labor supply chain look like, so that we know where data came from, what's the provenance of that data, like how do people know what happened after they produce that data. And then, to me, this other really critical piece that's beyond the line of sight for most consumers, it's that there are always people, often hired on a contract basis, contingently, who are working with that data, structuring it, making sense of it, making it something useful for computer scientists and engineers. There are constantly people in the loop who are making data useful to multinationals, from localizing material, putting it in a language that wasn't originally the language that was used to produce a function, to being able to give it cultural context. So multinationals, looking at how multinationals are producing, making artificial intelligence, and seeing this global labor supply chain could be the beginning of a route into both the rules to put in place, but also the rituals around how to manage that workflow, and how to create audits in the way that we have for the textile industry, the food industry. We have points of reference for how to manage AI as a workflow.
Yeah, and I've always found that perspective of highlighting the labor involved in so important, because we tend to think of all the machine language programmers, sitting in Silicon Valley, and that work looks very different than the folks who are tagging and producing data, et cetera. So, Sasha, I'd like to turn to you now for a moment, because we've talked a little bit about like large institutions in terms of government, the private sector, and companies, and we've touched on the impact on people, but you take a very people-centric view to this issue. So I'm curious to get your perspective as you think about what is it that we can do to help people with their own sort of rituals or behaviors to either help government or private sector, but even just on their own, what kind of autonomy would they have in this world to make sure that AI is leading to more positive outcomes than negative outcomes?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I mean, I think at the Algorithmic Justice League, one of the things that we're trying to do is explore how to develop exactly those type of mechanisms for people to participate more effectively in the development and oversight and accountability of algorithmic decision systems. So we like to say, you know, if you have a face, you have a place in the conversation about facial recognition technology, or if you have a voice, you should have a choice in the conversation about voice analysis technology, right? And one of the ways that we're doing that right now is we're developing a new project called the Algorithmic Vulnerability Bounty Project. And we're trying to really develop it according to that principle of nothing about us without us that I mentioned earlier. And we want to do that. This project is going to help us prevent, report, and redress algorithmic harms. And the way we're going to do a team of algorithmic justice agents and community partners who are community-based organizations that already work with communities that are being most harmed by algorithmic decision systems. So for example, community-based organizations that are working on criminal justice reform and are looking at face surveillance technology or are looking at other forms of carceral technology like predictive policing and so on and so forth. And so we're going to partner with community-based organizations in a number of different domains, as well as with companies that want to kind of take the high road in terms of developing equitable and accountable AI systems that are less harmful to people. And we are going to work together to basically do iterative discovery, scoping, and prototyping of tools that would help people report harms, verify those harms, and then work together with tool developers and maintainers to improve the systems to reduce those harms, as well as to seek redress for people who've been harmed by these systems. So for example, people are reporting things that they think are instances of algorithmic racism to the Algorithmic Justice League on a daily basis. And so what we need to do is figure out, okay, we've got a whole bunch of people are all suddenly reporting that, I don't know, that a particular, you know, a camera doesn't recognize their face, right? So then we would say, well, can we verify this? Let's gather a whole bunch of instances. Let's reach out to the developer of this system and see if this is a known problem already. If it's not, are they willing to provide, you know, access that would let us evaluate the system? And if they're not willing to do so, is there a way that we can reverse engineer or work around them to verify what's going on? And then we're trying to take a page from the security industry, where over the last couple decades, this process has been developed of coordinated vulnerability disclosure. And what that means is that when hackers discover flaws in security systems, you know, in the past, most of the incentives were for them to sell those flaws on the black market so that people could then exploit them. And what's evolved over time is a system that's not perfect, but it provides some incentives for hackers to receive payment either from the companies themselves or the public institution or from third-party platforms to report the vulnerability that they have discovered. And then the platforms will usually, you know, contact the firms and say, well, now you have 6 months to fix this vulnerability, and at the end of that time, we're going to publish it. And so that provides an incentive for people to discover flaws, for companies to pay people to discover them, rather than try and, you know, sue them or hide them, and then to fix them before they are disclosed. And so what we're wondering in the Algorithmic Vulnerability Bounty Project is, can we set up a similar system where people can report and then verify algorithmic bias or algorithmic harms, and then there will be a coordinated disclosure of that for that company or potentially across a whole industry, because often, you know, many tool developers will have similar, you know, problems in their systems. And so if we can discover these problems and set up an incentive mechanism where the companies have X amount of time to fix it, and then it's going to be publicly disclosed, we're exploring whether that can lead to a world where there are less harms occurring, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in on that point, what I love about this approach that Sasha is describing is that there was really a culture shift in security and privacy where there was enough incentive to start collaborating, to see value in identifying where there are security breaches or holes that could be harmful. In the case of AI, being able to create a relationship that's much more collaborative, that sees the mutual benefit that could come from companies and public sector that are developing artificial intelligence systems meant to create more efficiencies in decision making, finding common ground. And we haven't gotten there yet precisely because we're treating so much of AI as though it's decided outside of any sort of social conversation. When we start moving to the relationship that Sasha's describing, where there is a real mutual benefit, then it opens up opportunities also for redress when there is damage. And look, I think the hard reality is that artificial intelligence, any of these systems, they're experimental. In fact, I've often said, like, signing a data oath that suggests you're not going to do harm as a computer scientist or engineer is fraught from the beginning, because the reality is in most cases we're testing out systems, and that means in an experimental setting there is always the potential for damage and risk. And in our work internally at Microsoft Research, we're the only federally registered ethics review program in the tech industry, precisely because we know that there are established norms and rituals around how to look at, analyze potential risks, be able to identify benefits, be able to seek justice and benefit and balance in distribution of value of building something. So we're applying that model that's quite familiar to anyone who works with people. If you work with people or people's data, there's already a mechanism in place today that we could expect all tech companies to use today to be able to evaluate what it is they want to build. The problem is once something is built, it becomes a much more difficult problem to manage. But if we can get in there and think we're running experiments to benefit, sure, private industry, but ultimately society needs to benefit too. How would we organize our approach to these technologies with that at the center of everything we do?
You know, it's interesting because what we've been discussing strikes me as almost a resilient framing to how we go forward, meaning one of a difference of trying to be rigid and minimizing all harm, which I think tends to lead people to sweep it under the rug, and another, which is to have it a little bit more out in the open and have a bit of a learning loop or correction loop. And it's somewhat analogous to when I think about the National Transportation Safety Board and the black boxes they put on planes, where plane crashes are obviously horrible things and want to prevent them as much as possible. A bit of a learning loop of constantly bringing that data, analyzing what happened, and then putting in some fixes. We've seen dramatic increases in safety from flying over the years. And so I'm curious, that sort of is one imagination of what a beginning of a regulatory process or a governance process could look like. I'm curious, Sonal, as you've seen government in so many different contexts, are there similar examples or analogs that you think about, that you've seen, that we could learn from in terms of how we could create more of this learning loop and how we could make harm something we acknowledge as being bad, but something that we can surface and proactively deal with and problem solve going forward?
Yeah, it's a great conversation, and really appreciate Sasha's points here and Mary's points. I think the piece I might suggest here for a second is I think what's happened in the last maybe couple of decades is we've stopped trusting government. We assume that if we give data to the government, something's bad has happened, and largely because we put everything in a security frame, and we don't always think about it from a from a public good frame. And so what you just explained with the NTSB, the Transportation Security Board, is important, because what we trust in that is the government is going in, they're going to do the analysis, but then they report out the analysis. They're not hiding it. They're telling the public what they've learned, how they've learned it, and what's going to change. And I think that's an important thing that we need to remember from the public sector perspective, is to rebuild trust requires bringing people in, making sure we're being honest about what we're getting. And yes, and then to Mary's point, we are going to make mistakes. We are going to learn that something didn't work, or we were intending to do something. Public health is a great example of this right now. Just imagine COVID, right? If you remember, under the Obama-Biden administration, there was Ebola, and we were looking at this data, and we were understanding where it was coming from, and we were getting ahead of it because we were looking at information differently. And it's been happening over generations. We're now sort of talking about it from a software perspective, but this sort of algorithmic thinking has been around for a long time. This is not a new concept. It's what the census has been doing, with what we've been doing with census data, what we've been doing with public health data. This has been important, and it's an important place where we use it, but it's recognizing that trust matters. Trust that the information that's coming to you is real information. Trust that there's a transparency in the conversation. And I think what we all need to learn, even in the public sector side, is to be honest with the public when something isn't working, not just telling them or papering over when it's not working. Companies have also faced the same problem. And I think Mary can probably, when you try to paper over it, is when you sort of break down that trust barrier. And it's important that we sort of use that information effectively and make sure we're sort of providing the information up front. So the role of the public sector and the way we use it is making sure diverse stakeholders are in the room. That is the job of the public sector, to make sure there is diversity in the room. Ask what's happening and what mistakes are we making. Modify it as we do it, and it gets better. NTSB has gotten better over the years. It was not perfect at the beginning when it first started. It changed, it learned, it adapted, and we've had fewer and fewer plane crashes thanks to, or train crashes or other things, thanks to the NTSB's continual learning. And that's been happening in public health. It's been happening in education, but we have to keep answering that question. And the role of the public sector is to be honest with the public when we're learning in the process, and having that public conversation. I think that's important, but it also means the private sector and the nonprofit sector have to be at the table, as Sasha has pointed out. I mean, you want the Algorithmic Justice League sitting at the table with the public sector when they are building and thinking through this, to say, what are we missing? What happened? What are community groups telling us? And which groups have been left out that we should be thinking about? Is the disability rights group at the table? Is the African American community at the table? Is the Latino community at the table? Those are important questions we should be asking. And that's important from a public sector perspective, that we are transparent, we are honest, and we are learning in the process and telling the public we're doing that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of the points that were just made. I just want to add, a couple additional observations. One is that we've been talking a lot about sort of framing governance as something that maybe happens after the fact, rather than as something that's constantly shaping the playing field and the conversation. In addition to that, there's another piece of the conversation about AI development and the relationship to the public sector that I just think should be on the table, which is that it's also about incentives. So nation states play an extremely important role in the development of artificial intelligence through national policy priorities and through, frankly, quite massive investment in both the core technologies and some of the preferred applications of these tools. And unfortunately, right now, a lot of that investment is focused on military objectives. And I think that we also need to have a conversation about how do we shift that. So a lot of the development, is basically about how do we achieve military dominance? How do we develop new smart weapons, and so on and so forth? How do we develop strategic tools that can help us with warfighting? And I think that a lot of people would like to see a realignment of spending priorities in national budgets. And this is not just in the US, this is China's AI program, US's AI objectives. We need to think about what would it look like if the public sector spending on AI was primarily focused on improving education for all, or improving health outcomes for all. I think we might have a very different. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. And I think what I'll do now is turn to some of the audience questions that have been coming in, which is fantastic. So maybe one to try and tie this whole conversation to something that's practical and that people are thinking about. We have a question coming in from LinkedIn from Khan Russo. And this could be either, anyone could jump in, but why don't I suggest Sonal to get your first perspective. How can we use AI to respond to the pending eviction cliff, which will lead to tens of thousands of homeless individuals? And so I think that's a fantastic practical issue. We all sort of see it coming. What are some of your thoughts on that? Sorry, Sonal, directed to you.
Sorry, what a great question to be asking, and what a perfect time to be asking this question. Exactly. We should know where families are being evicted, or where there aren't places where people can afford to pay their mortgages right now. There was a report that came out this morning about federal home mortgages and how many, I think there's like an 18% decline in the ability to pay for federal home mortgages. We should be able to predict that, work with those families. Imagine if we did the services right, Con, we would be being able to provide those services immediately to those families now, before they get kicked out of their homes, to make sure that there's a payment going to them, rather than waiting 6 months until we pass a bill, know that we have to get them the money. But if states and cities and counties knew that information, we were getting that information, we can get ahead of that curve and help families, especially before the school year is starting, not get evicted. And that is a critical thing that we should be doing. And it's exactly what AI used well and with all of everything Sasha said put into context, used well, that would actually be very helpful to families and communities. But we have to be thinking proactively and not reactively. And too often when we think about AI, we think about it as a reactive, and not how do we prevent something from happening, as opposed to stop something once it's been done. So this is a great place. This is a perfect area. Evictions is a perfect area. We know where this is going to happen. We already know from data coming in from private apartment complexes and other places where people aren't paying. How do we use that data effectively to both help families and at the same time work with those complexes and those landowners to make sure that they're not evicting those families, and figure out a process of how do we support the whole ecosystem to make sure that families can stay in their homes, especially as we're thinking about it today and how bad the economy is, but also when we think about schools starting and making sure children get to continue to go to have classes online or wherever it might be. But it's important for us to be thinking about that. And that's a perfect example.
So if I could, I want to underscore and tease out something Sonal's saying that's so critical, that right now, most of our energy is spent on having AI work as a decision-making machine. We are so focused on, can it just wholesale replace what people need to decide next? The best use of artificial intelligence is in that predictive modeling of what could happen next, rather than deciding what should happen next. So Sonal just gave a great example of, we could be using artificial intelligence and just algorithmic modeling, nothing fancy, to be able to see where are their patterns, where do we already, and we already frankly have the sociological data, the demographic data that tells us where residential evictions are most likely to happen. So we know where we might need to intervene. How could we use modeling to be able to make better decisions that surface how would we proceed, not decide who and shouldn't, who should get relief, who should not, but surface who might need it most, and just go there. Like, that is the best application of these tools, is to think about how does it surface places where humans need to jump in and make a very hard decision. Virginia Eubanks has a beautiful book about this. Sasha's book, Design Justice, does a beautiful job talking about how would you design something that's surfacing awareness of a particular need, rather than having it wholesale take over to make decisions. And that's, at the end of the day, if we can shift all of our attention to rules and rituals around how are we building what we're building, how are we doing it with the intention that it's never replacing people, it is supplementing what we need to do as decision makers. And in some cases, we'll identify low-hanging fruit, low-stake situations where we want artificial intelligence to take over. In most cases, that's not a good application of artificial intelligence. It does a terrible job in situations if it doesn't have a lot of priors to learn from. And we're in the middle of a pandemic, an unprecedented moment. This is not the time to test out artificial intelligence decision-making capacity.
I think that this is such an excellent example for so many different reasons. One is that, it really illustrates the way that AI tends to reproduce existing forms of structural inequality when it is used as a decision-making tool. So that means that people who are already most marginalized tend to bear the greatest burden of bad decisions, and those who are most powerful tend to receive the most benefits. And specifically, that means that, AI systems, unless we are careful, tend to reproduce white supremacy and anti-Blackness. They tend to reproduce patriarchy and sexism. They tend to reproduce ableism and discrimination against disabled people, and so on and so forth. And so in the case of evictions, yes, of course, right now we're facing a huge crisis of both evictions and home loss, and that is going to be disproportionately borne by Black people and by people of color, more broadly, Black and brown people. And I think, to me, this illustrates another important second point that should always be present in the conversation. And I talk about this a lot in my book, Design Justice, in a section on scoping, and the way that scoping in design processes is often an anti-politics machine. So that means that the way that we think about the boundaries of the problem sometimes make it impossible for us to really think about and address or put forward solutions that would actually, help the most people and help the most marginalized. So when we talk about evictions, we don't need to build an AI system to help us figure out, who should be the ones to get evicted. We need to issue a moratorium on evictions and on mortgage payments. The banks should be told that they can't claim these things. That keeps the homeowners from losing their homes, and it keeps the landlords from being put in the difficult space, even if they're a well-meaning landlord, right? Of saying, well, I've got to kick this person out because I owe, my mortgage to the bank. So we need a moratorium. And then after that, maybe we could use AI to identify the landlords and the banks that are violating the moratorium. So we could develop a predictive tool to say, who's been a bad landlord in the past and is most likely to ignore this temporary moratorium, so that we could make sure that they're not evicting people against this public policy decision that we've made in a moment of unprecedented crisis. So again, the scope that we consider when we're talking about the problem area, we need to be able to zoom in or zoom out and not assume that it's the technology itself that should be placed first. We need to use a human-centered design process to think about what's the mix of technologies and regulatory intervention to deal with large-scale problems.
It's such an interesting point. I'll just make a quick comment. In many ways, I see how we deploy and implement technology has the same risks as when we develop political systems. And there's this assumed neutrality to technology. And I came across a great example or story or metaphor. And it was about, if you have some really big kids playing a game against littler kids, the big kids will usually win, even if they're inventing the rules and improvising and everything like that. And just because you put in some rules for the game and you put in a neutral referee doesn't mean that now the little kids are going to win against the big kids. In fact, what you've done is just kind of systematized that inequality by an apparently neutral system. And I feel like that's one of the big risks we have with AI, as we are now seeing through this summer and what's revealing itself all those risks that we have from what was perceived to be kind of like rules and regulations that are revealing racial and social justice issues. So
Yeah,
with that sort of, go ahead, Mary.
can I just say it's inevitable? I mean, I think the hard reality is it's not just a risk that we will replay every structural bias and system of oppression we have. It is literally inevitable because we have no way of building these technologies without basing them on prior human actions and decisions. So I think it's so critical for us to not just imagine it's a risk, but see it as inevitable if we are not actively pursuing, surfacing what bias did we just deploy? What's the correction? Like if we really just go there and say, that means there are places where what we need is regulatory force that says you do not want AI in a decision-making position, that where there has to be a chain of accountability that connects to a person. No more like AI did it, I had no capacity. It's like, no, in every case, there's an objective that's being defined implicitly or explicitly. And we now are all aware that it has to be an explicit decision. What are we trying to achieve? And people need to be held accountable for the failures that are inevitable. And we need to be able to get to a place to accept that the failure is inevitable. Sorry, I just had to say that.
I feel like that's been, no, I feel like that's been an interesting theme through our conversation, which is we're not going to be able to eliminate the failures or harms. They're inevitable. So we need a mechanism to manage them to some degree, if I could summarize that. And I feel that fits, or it could fit, at least in my experience, some of the private sector methodologies, ideologies. I hate this phrase, and I think we've all learned to hate it, but like, move fast and break things, right? But to capture that ethos of it's okay to make mistakes and you just keep moving, adapting. I feel like that's a problem when it comes to government. The ideas of failures that get jumped on with gotcha, journalism, with a political party that's ready to pounce. And so I'm curious, Sonal, like, how do you see that playing out? How can we get this kind of idea, which seems like a central idea to developing any kind of AI governance system, that failure and harm are inevitable and we need to manage it, when people's careers and political careers can get killed by just one mistake that hits the headlines?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's important here that you don't start big. You don't change the whole system at the same time. You start small and you test different pieces and you see what you learn from it, you adapt it, and then you sort of build on it. I think the challenge that we faced in government is we buy big systems and we don't buy it in little chunks and think about how to do small pieces, adapt, learn, and then buy more and do more. But when we think about learn and break fast and sort of learn leaning forward, what we forget sometimes, especially in tech companies, is they're not doing the whole kit and caboodle at the same time. They're starting little pieces and they're testing it, and then they're learning, and then they're adapting. And that is what government needs to do. But I think what government and the burden on government that's even bigger is being transparent with the public and being honest when something isn't working. You don't have the ability to just say, hey, let's sweep this under the rug, because it does come out. You have to be able to talk about it. So if there is something that we did and it was big and it was wrong, we should also talk about it and be honest about it, because that transparency in today's time, everything is going to get revealed no matter what we think. And I think too often we sort of have this old mentality in our heads of like, oh, we'll fix it and then we'll tell everybody. It's like, no, we have to sort of be honest about it along the way and be right there with the public and say, look, we made a mistake. I think we underestimate the public's ability to accept hard truths. And what we tend to want to do is tell them that, oh, we'll fix it, don't worry. But we have to recognize that the public understands that we all live in a complex system. We know we all make mistakes and we're willing to accept it, but we just have to be honest about it and not lie about it.
Great point. Okay, so we're running out of time here, and I've got a long list of questions from the audience. I'm going to try and move through some of these quickly so we can get kind of like a lightning round of responses. Sasha, why don't we start with you? We've talked about harms, but also this notion of choice has come up, and we have a question from Hans Friedhoff through LinkedIn. So what are the mechanisms by which you see individuals or consumers exercising choices over whether to participate in AI systems or not?
Well, yeah, I think that that's a great question. Right now, the mechanisms are not robust. I think that one possibility is that people need to, first of all, learn more about these systems and how they work. And you can learn how to do, simple machine learning exercises and so on and so forth. So I think there needs to be an expansion of education that will also help to build the pipeline of people who can participate in the design and development of these systems. And people are also refusing these systems. So for example, at the municipal level, there's a growing number of cities where city councils and municipal government have said, we don't want facial recognition technology being used by law enforcement or by city government. And that's something that's produced by, everyday people gathering together with advocates like the ACLU or like the AJL or others to say, we need to press pause on these until there are better oversight mechanisms in place. So people can vote, people can get educated, people can learn how to build their own tools. And another mechanism is through legal action. So as people become more aware of how legal harms, of how harms operate, people are joining class actions to hold companies accountable when harm has been produced.
Okay, thank you. We've gotten so many questions coming in. I apologize to all the people who took the time. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. But maybe I could ask Mary to take a first pass at this next question. How do government in developing countries get started on supporting AI applications?
I mean, picking up on what Sasha just said, being able to think about this move to a basic education that we've actually never really made available in public education around a kind of literacy, a computational literacy, is really necessary. I mean, there were so many assumptions, decades ago that a particular Gen X or Gen Z or Gen Y would just understand how technologies work because they use them every day. We've got good empirical evidence that all of us need the basic training to understand the technologies we use, to understand how they function. That's not, we all need that. I don't understand how my printer works. I should understand that. So the beginning of it is seeing all of us need basic training in these technologies that are a part of our everyday lives. They're ubiquitous. That doesn't mean there aren't lessons we need to learn. And the connection to thinking about the global south in places where there's incredible creativity, incredible work that's going into building out technologies, it's being able to see the value of their creative contributions to this mix, recognizing that value, and creating, again, a kind of global labor supply chain that doesn't just extract that value, but compensates it. So, developing countries have as much capacity in this new world of developing decision making, precisely because the decision making often has local context. It has linguistic nuance. Everything we're learning from is coming from a place. It's in a location, a place and time. So every country has the capacity to be building these decision-making systems that really address their needs. The fundamental starting point is seeing it as an educational intervention. We all need the tutorials around how does this work and how do we contribute to building what we want to see in the world, as Sasha was saying.
Great. And I think we have time for one more question, picking up on this global point. And, Sonal, since you raised it in terms of the multi-levels of conversations, I'll steer this to you first. So how do we avoid embedding Western biases and thought processes in AI? Every culture thinks about issues differently. Will AI result in one size fits all, or will it meet these needs? And this is coming in from Prashant over Twitter.
This is a great question. And I think both Mary and Sasha have sort of answered this question in multiple ways, which is, again, who's coding the technology? What is it being used for? What's the problem we're trying to solve? How do communities actually receive the information, not just what we want to convey? Too often in the public sector, we're busy conveying information and not listening to how people are receiving information. And what is it that people are hearing matters, and asking that question, whether you're in India, whether you're in Pakistan, whether you're in Sri Lanka, whether you're in Kenya, asking those questions matters. Every government should be thinking about about this, there is no off-the-shelf software that's equally available and going to work for every country exactly the same. It's just not. You have to be asking, what's the problem you're solving? Is AI the right tool for it? Is this software the right tool? Or should we be, to Sasha's point, should we just putting an eviction moratorium versus, you know, creating an AI tool that helps us figure out where evictions are happening? And then answering the question, what is the public receiving when they're receiving that information? And that's important for us to be thinking about together, because there is no easy answer to this. We think of platforms as just universally, ubiquitously, equally available, and bias is built in. Data is, the collection of data that we have is also biased. You know, what we choose to collect, how we choose to collect, the questions we ask, it requires constant testing. And just to answer one final question, I think both Mary and Sasha said, I think everybody should learn what data is. I think everybody should learn how to do statistics, because it is actually more important today that we understand statistics and the use of bias than we've ever had before. And I think this should be a common thing that every child should learn about, because if we don't understand it, we're going to be victims of it.
And with that, unfortunately, I think I have to bring this session to a close. So first, I want to thank the panelists. Your perspectives were so interesting, and I really enjoyed listening to all, as I know the audience did, to whom I am grateful for all the questions. And I'm so sorry that we only got to a very, very small percentage of them. But we will try and address some of the questions that have come in over our own social media platforms as well. And I know everyone's mind is right now on the pandemic, but I'm so glad we carved out the time to have this conversation, because this is a great transformation that's happening in the world. And we tried to really catalyze and for ourselves kickstart the conversation with the Bellagio meeting and the report that we put out. This is the kind of conversation where we can share ideas, hear back from folks, and inform all of our thinking, as we have to take an all of society approach to this question of what will be the rules and rituals around AI that help make sure that we maximize its benefits and minimize its harms over time. So thanks, and everyone have a great rest of your day. Thanks very much again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.